Hello, and welcome back to the Loco Files. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the Great Western Railway Dukedogs. The Great Western Railway 3200 class, or Earl class, was a design of 440 steam locomotive for passenger use. The nickname for this class was Dukedog, since the locomotives were comprised of former Duke-class boilers and Bulldog-class frames. As such, they were one of the last standard-gauge steam locomotive classes to retain outside frames. The class survived until 1960, with one member surviving into preservation. The GWR absorbed the Cambrian Railways in 1923, but with the Cambrian main line being lightly built and permanent weight restrictions forbade the use of heavier locomotives. This meant that only a few classes of Great Western locomotive were allowed to run over the lines, including the Duke class. However, by the 1930s, the Duke-class engines were past their working lives, and in particular the frames were in pretty poor condition. At the same time, the heavier Bulldog class was becoming redundant and being withdrawn, and later members of the class had an improved straight-topped frame design. In December 1929, Duke number 3265, tree pole and pen, was withdrawn, and the cab and other above-frame fittings, together with a spare Duke boiler and smokebox, were fitted to the straight-topped frames of Bulldog number 3365 Charles Gray Mott. The rebuilt locomotive was given the name and number of the Duke. This resulted in an engine with stronger frames which could still be used on yellow weight-restricted routes. The conversion was a success, and from 1936, 29 new locomotives were constructed from the relevant components of withdrawn Dukes and Bulldogs. The classification of the rebuilds as new locomotives had advantages in the railway's accounts, and they were given new numbers in the 3200 series. A further 11 conversions were scheduled, but the onset of World War II brought a halt to the programme. The prototype conversion retained its Duke name and number, 3265, tree pole and pen. The first nominally new locomotive was numbered 3201 and originally kept the name of the parent Duke. A decision was taken to name the class after living earls who had some connection with the Great Western. Apparently, as a rebuttal to repeated requests from the aristocratic Great Western directors for engines to be named after them, the CME of the Great Western, Charles Collett, decided that these new engines, with their decidedly old-fashioned Victorian appearance, should be given the name of those directors. When they were assembled at Paddington Station for the unveiling of the new class, the group were not impressed at Collett's joke. So, although the first batch of 20 were allocated Earl names, following the construction and naming of number 3212 Earl of Eldon in May 1937, the nameplates were removed and the names were given to numbers 5043 to 5062 of the Castle class instead. The class were mainly allocated to the Cambrian mainline, where they remained one of the few classes of locomotive that British Rail inherited that were light enough to be permitted on the wooden Barmouth Bridge, along with the Great Western Collett goods and the LMS Ivet Class II moguls. As a result, they remained in regular use until the 1950s. Withdrawals began in 1948, and the class slowly but surely began to fade from the limelight, with them being demoted from the Cambrian Coast Express by BR Standard Class 4 460s. However, this didn't necessarily mean they were ignored by rail enthusiasts, as in 1960, two members of the class, numbers 9004 and 9014 were tasked with taking the Talyllyn Railway Preservation Society's members to their AGM that they would take over at Shrewsbury. Along with 9017, both engines were withdrawn later in the year. 9017 was subject to the first ever public appeal for funds to preserve a standard gauge locomotive and send it down to the Bluebell Railway, as it was the only preserved line suitable for standard gauge locomotives at the time. It was looked after by District Travel Superintendent Oliver Velton at Oswestry Works in 1961. To give time for funds to be raised. Despite this, the appeal actually failed, and if it wasn't for Tom Gom and Peter Summers, we may very well have lost this class forever. Thankfully, the locomotive was saved and arrived on the Bluebell on February 15th, 1962, and in September 1963 it gained the name Earl of Berkeley from Castle Class 5060. It then continued to run for another 10 years before returning to traffic again in 1982. In between overhauls, the engine visited some heritage railways including the Severn Valley. The engine has been out of service since 2011 due to a series of serious boiler and mechanical issues. In 2024, the locomotive left the Bluebell to be put on display at the museum at the Vale of Rydal Railway on a 2-year loan. Upon the engine's return, it has been identified as a good candidate for overhaul once space is freed up at Sheffield Park. I would like to thank you all for watching and listening. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like. If you want to see what we cover next on the show, feel free to subscribe. And feel free to share your memories of the Dukedogs down below in the comments, whether you rode on them in revenue earning service or were lucky enough to ride on 9017 when it was running. But yes, anyway, thank you and goodbye.